deregulation of a whole suite of financial innovations which the 1990s gave us. Innovations, new ways to package and reallocate risk that were, because they were deregulated, invisible to the market. So my friend Frank Partnoy calculated this for me. He said in 1980, 98% of all of the financial assets in our economy were subject to the ordinary, traditional New Deal rules of transparency, anti-fraud requirements, and trade on a public exchange, making it possible to track price movements in a way that helped the economy. 2% were over-the-counter, meaning they were trades that nobody necessarily knew about, they weren't subject to transparency requirements, and weren't even subject to anti-fraud requirements. By 2008, those numbers had reversed. 90% of the financial assets traded in our economy were over-the-counter, outside of the view of the traditional structures of regulation, which leading to a shadow banking market, which Quack and Johnson say encouraged this bubble that we saw burst. But that alone isn't enough for this story. In addition to too little government, there was too much government. Throughout the 1990s, the government signaled that there would be a government guarantee if this bubble burst. Guarantee in the form of bailouts, producing perhaps the dumbest kind of socialism ever invented by man, socializing risk while privatizing the benefit. Now, as a policy for a nation to embrace to govern their financial sector, this is, it's a technical term, but insanely stupid. So why did we do it? What led us to this? And again, it's puzzling because this isn't actually coherent with any of the espoused policies of either of the two parties. So it's a puzzle if you look at the principles, but this is the one thing we know. The fastest growing sector in contributions to candidates on both the Democrat and the Republican side was the financial sector, the security sector, the fastest among those for the period 1990 to 2008, leading again to the question that these examples are meant to suggest. Or one more here. Think about this catastrophe, the Deepwater Horizon. When this happened, many people ask, well, how is it that we could have had such an extraordinary experimental drilling system out there in the Gulf without any extensive environmental impact or risk studies done? After all, where I come from, we've just spent 9 years and burned 10,000 pages of studies to facilitate the building of something like this in the Cape so that we can have clean energy. So when you look at something like this, the environmental studies for this experimental drilling, you must wonder, well, what was the equivalent study that was done for that? The answer is, after 17 pages, the government exempted the drilling from any further analysis here, exempted it because it was said not to be necessary according to the structure of regulations that existed. Now, when Congress heard this, of course, Congress was shocked.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. Oh, thank you very much.
Yet, of course, it was Congress that had required this structure of regulation, requiring approval within 30 days of these kinds of applications. Why is it? Well, again, the only thing we can be certain of here is an endless amount of campaign cash driven to Congress to drive the agencies to adopt this system of regulation. Now, one final example. Think about the healthcare bill. Barack went to Washington promising to change D.C., and after healthcare passed, there was a brief flurry of excitement as people suggested that maybe he had done exactly that. Ezra Klein wrote this piece that was titled in a very misleading way, Twilight of the Interest Groups. And he said in the piece, the Obama administration succeeded at neutralizing every single industry. Now, I look at the history and I say, I don't think it's quite like that. My view is closer to Glenn Greenwald's. This is what Glenn said in response to Ezra. If by neutralizing, Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefits, then he is absolutely right. But being able to force the government to bribe and accommodate you is not a reflection of your powerlessness, quite the opposite. The way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it had to be done that way, but one cannot deny that it was. Leading to the words of perhaps the 20th century's greatest philosopher, David Byrne, it is same as it ever was in this system. Now, in each case, I simply have to point to money, and your trust in this system is eroded. And my claim here has three parts. Number one, it is because of cases like this that you and most Americans believe money buys results in Congress. Indeed, a poll we conducted last month found that 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress. Skewed a little bit depending on the party, 81% of Democrats, 71% of Republicans, but I can tell you by looking at similar polls before the recent switch in the House that before the switch it was 81% of Republicans and 71% of Democrats who believe money buys results in Congress. Number two, that belief erodes our trust in this institution and makes us much less willing to participate in making it govern properly. And number three, we can understand that weakening in trust by understanding the dependence we all recognize this system to reveal. So our framers gave us what they said a republic. But by a republic, what they meant was a, quote, representative democracy. And that democracy had an intended dependence. As Federalist 52 puts it, the democratic branch of this government would be a branch to be dependent upon the people alone. So their picture, if they would have had my graphics, they could have had something like this. It's pretty cool, right? Watch. See the way that works? Yeah. So Congress, dependent upon the people, was their model for congressional independence. But the problem here is that over these last 30 years, we have evolved a different dependence. A dependence increasingly upon the funders. As Bob Kaiser describes in this fantastic book, So Damn Much Money, the last 30 years has changed the economy of influence of Washington as lobbying has evolved to become a machine that permits policy to be distorted or sold. And that's possible because members must spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to either get back to Congress themselves or to give their party the party dues necessary to allow their party to be competitive to get back in power again. And in this process, members develop a sixth sense, an awareness about how whatever they do might or might not affect their ability to continue to raise money. They become shape-shifters, bending themselves in the way they must to make sure they can continue to raise the money they need. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes when she went to Congress, a senior member of her delegation told her, quote, "Always lean to the green." And then to clarify matters, she went on to say, he was not an environmentalist. The point is, this is a dependency on the funders. It's different and conflicting from a dependency on the people because, this should be obvious, the funders are not the people. Indeed, in the biggest study we have to measure this, we can say that for people making less than $75,000 a year, 80% never give to any political campaign. But people who make more than $75,000 a year, 80% give to political campaigns. Meaning that this gap between the people and the funders is pronounced and significant. It has two consequences. Number one, it bends policy towards the funders. This extraordinary study by Martin Gylens of Princeton took more than 1,500 surveys that measured attitudes of people as a function of whether they were rich or the rest of us, and evaluated those attitudes against changes in government policy. And what he found was when the attitudes of the rich, and that is the proxy for those who fund the campaigns, conflicted with the attitudes of the rest of the public. His question was, what does Congress do? And the answer was, when Americans with different incomes levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflect the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of the poor or middle-income Americans. A vast discrepancy exists between what the framers intended Congress to be responsive to and what this Congress is actually responsive to. In that sense, it distorts the process. And it weakens our trust in this institution. As our trust in this institution decays, as this number suggests, because we believe this institution corrupt. But not corrupt in a kind of Rob Blagojevich sense. Not corrupt because people are handing around in secret bags of cash, which they're buying other people's votes with. This is not that grotesque corruption. Indeed, in that sense, this Congress is the cleanest Congress in the history of our Congress. It's not the secret influence, secret corruption. This is corruption in plain sight. This is a corruption we could call a dependency corruption, as we see that the dependency intended by the framers has been corrupted by this economy of influence of the funders. And we can make the same point when thinking about the judicial branch, at least in the states. Courts are intended to be dependent upon the law, but what we know when we look at elections for state judges around the country is that increasingly we see a gap between a dependency upon the law and a dependency upon the funders. In 2008, $45.6 million was spent in judicial elections around the nation, 7 times the amount spent in 1990. And that has led this extraordinary former Justice O'Connor to spend significant part of her life fighting this process of corruption by fighting judicial elections that yield this pattern of spending. As she said, that judges face unprecedented pressure from interest groups, and it's increasingly hard to have faith in the system. Well, in fact, we don't have faith in the system. 76% of Americans believe that campaign contributions at the state level influence judicial decisions. 70% of judges express concern that in 1/2 of all state Supreme Court cases, the parties have contributed to the judges who are deciding the case. And 46% of those very same judges believe that the contributions have at least a little influence in the outcome of the decision. Now, in Texas, everything's much bigger, I hear, so we can say that 79% of Texas lawyers believe that campaign contributions significantly influence a judge's decision. So here again, we have a wrong dependence that's producing a loss of trust, a kind of corruption, and again, not the corruption of bribery in its old traditional sense, but a corruption of the intended dependency that all of us believe any judicial system should have. So, what should we do about these forms of corruption? Well, the solution, in my view, is to make the funders the people. Follow the example of states like Arizona, a plainly red state, and Maine, a kind of confused state, and Connecticut, a plainly blue state, to set up systems for small dollar funded elections so that candidates opt into a system where they take no more than small dollar contributions, making it impossible for anybody to believe money was driving the result. Now, I've seen the promised land in this conception of how to fund elections. Let me describe a little bit of what it looks like. It's a mixture of grants and Franklins. In my view, the best system of the way this would work. So here's the best system in my view. You can pick on it, but here's the way it works. Take this fact stipulated. Every voter in America produces at least $50 in federal revenue. That doesn't mean they all pay $50 in income tax, but if you add all the taxes that we are exposed to, from gasoline tax to cigarette taxes to transportation taxes, at least $50 comes to the federal revenue because of each of us. So,